Matt Kaufman,
Jonas Heim,
and this is Burning Issues. Welcome to our third episode in a mini-series where we are examining the California wildfires and what they can teach us about policy broadly.
Today we're going to seek to answer what can the wildfires teach us about utility regulation. For this episode, we will be guided by Matt, so take it away.
Thanks, Jonas. Really excited to dive deep into utility regulations and how that intersects with the wildfires out in California. I felt that in order to really get at the regulatory issues, it's important to take a look at one of the key actors in the wildfire scene in California, and that's Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E. And so my quest to understand that utility led me to
Catherine Blunt. I cover renewable energy and utilities for the Wall Street Journal.
Catherine has covered utilities for a while, but PG&E's most recent fires inspired her to write a book aptly titled California Burning: The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and What It Means for America's Power Grid. Welcome to the show. How would you describe the fall of PG&E as you noted in your book's title?
So this is a very complex story, and I think for those outside of California who might not be quite as familiar with the dynamics of the company, just high-level background, this is a utility whose equipment has started a number of really deadly and destructive fires over the last 5 years or so, the deadliest of which occurred in 2018. It was the Camp Fire in Northern California. 84 people died. And it's a company that's been twice convicted on criminal charges for neglecting its infrastructure. First, a gas transmission system. There was a pipeline explosion in 2010 that killed 8 people and revealed that it really hadn't been maintaining the system properly. And then convicted on 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter for its role in the Camp Fire.
So while the fires are on the electric side of the business, I want to touch on briefly the San Bruno pipeline explosion, as it's a relevant comparison because it speaks to company culture as well as the cause of both incidents. We learned that PG&E was failing to maintain its pipes adequately, similarly to how its older equipment ended up starting the wildfires.
Certainly incentives were misaligned. Middle-level managers tasked with overseeing the integrity of the pipeline system just faced a lot of pressure in terms of the need to reduce the budget for inspections, essentially, at a time when the company had committed to fast, consistent earnings growth.
The gas system had missed inspections, which caused explosions. I totally get that. But what does inspection have to do with earning growth?
This is where we have to step back and understand the business model of PG&E and utilities broadly. So PG&E is one of what is called an investor-owned utility. And so what this means is the government's going to allow a company to have a monopoly operating in a given area, with the theory being upkeeping utility requires a lot of investment. Larger companies can do this more efficiently and have better access to capital. So the government regulates utilities through what's called a Public Utility Commission, or a PUC. And what the PUC does is it says, okay, utility company, you can earn a certain profit, but if utilities cut costs on things like inspections, they actually get to keep that cost as a profit until regulators reset customer bills in a few years. That's the regulator's role: determine the profit, determine the rates. In theory, this means that you're going to innovate as a company because you get to cut costs and get profits in the short term, and then those customers keep the savings and costs in the long term when rates get reset. Regulators, though, need to make sure that they're really hyper-focused on these cuts and ensure that the cuts and costs aren't at the expense of safety in case the utility is pushing too fast. And so it comes down to that business model.
PUC historically was very focused on the state's energy policy or enacting energy policies, and it was largely focused on reviewing the contracts that these utilities were coming forward with to procure more wind and solar. This was the sexier area to be in if you were within the regulator. These were good goals, right? I mean, this is important work, but the safety division didn't have as much cachet. And so the agency was historically challenged to really have a granular view of how each of the utilities were approaching safety issues.
Okay, so both PG&E and CPUC were coming up short. Is this something that usually happens? I mean, is this a feature or a bug of the investor-owned utility? Like, do you think PG&E would have acted differently if it were regulated differently?
I have been thinking about that a lot lately as I was researching this story, and I felt like I needed to get an expert involved on utility regulation, and so that's when I decided to go have a chat with
Bruce Cain, and I'm director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and I'm a professor of political science at Stanford University.
So I already described investor-owned utility models a bit earlier in a discussion with Jonas, but Bruce had a couple of call-outs about that structure in particular that I wanted to highlight.
They provide additional services, sometimes special programs for disadvantaged customers or special programs that incentivize the use of rooftop solar, et cetera. So these utilities, they're allowed to have a profit. That's built into the regulation that they are allowed to get a profit, and that, of course, is partly a problem for us in terms of incentives.
So it seems like the profit motivation may be more of a feature than a bug.
Right. The hope is that this profit motivation is put to a good use where then customers benefit in the long run and regulators are actually able to rein in the company and get that nice balance.
But we just saw in PG&E's case that maybe the regulators aren't as on top of it as they should be.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's where you have to think about the human factors in this and incentives for regulators, not just utilities, right? So the CPUC is made up of just normal people, and these people are appointed by the governor. In some states, they're elected, but in California, they're appointed by the governor, and that can lead to some issues, as Bruce was telling me.
Often these people come from the energy sector and go back into the energy sector. So that brings up the whole question of, are they really as independent of the company's interests as they should be?
So I want to come back to the idea of regulatory capture, where companies are controlling the regulators and not the other way around. Let's table that for a second. First, though, I think it's important to understand the alternative utility methods so that we can actually compare the investor-owned to the other ones. So Bruce mentions two more, the first being
publicly owned utility, and they actually range in size. Some of them are quite big, but some of them are small, like the one we have in Palo Alto. But SMUD,
the Sacramento Municipal Utility District,
very big and very innovative. They have some advantages in the sense that they don't have to build a profit in, but obviously there are political pressures that can enter in because you've got elected officials that are directly in charge of the utility. And so there's always the possibility that political factors that aren't necessarily optimal can figure in.
So this one is much closer to people than investor-owned.
Yeah, that's really fair, right? The publicly owned utilities, POUs, they're run by local officials. There's no investors that you're answerable to. In fact, you're answerable to the people. And so what that means is you're not seeking a profit. It can have rates that are, in theory, cheaper, but in actuality, oftentimes not cheaper when you compare it to an investor-owned utility.
How come? Without having a built-in profit, I'd assume they'd be lower and potentially safer because they aren't pushing to cut costs and to maximize profits, like we saw in PG&E's case.
Yeah, I think that's where we have to separate theory from reality. There are really good publicly owned utilities where that is the case, right? Your hypothesis is correct. But oftentimes you have to think about economies of scale and efficiencies that I was talking about earlier. So IOUs have really strong access to capital and also a strong incentive to cut costs that often push them to have rates lower. Public utilities, on the other hand, need bond measures for larger projects, and they often cut costs kind of less infrequently because that means they're getting rid of jobs maybe that are answerable at the local level, which is a little bit harder.
Right, well, except for the times when they cut things they shouldn't, like with PG&E.
Yeah, investor-owned utilities are definitely more at risk of cutting things that they shouldn't, whereas publicly owned utilities maybe don't cut enough. That's an unfortunate feature maybe of each of the regulatory systems, and that's when you need regulators for investor-owned utilities to try to thread that needle of balancing between those two types of utility structures. But before we get into this much more, Jonas, I really want to acknowledge the third type of utility. And this exists in places where utilities don't own generation assets and merely move electricity along wires. And California is one such place. So in a deregulated energy market where utilities don't generate the energy, in California specifically, that's led to a third type of utility called
community choice aggregation, because it allows local cities to combine to create load-serving entities that can go out and purchase their own energy contracts.
So the way to think about community choice aggregation is that, a normal person just gets their electricity off the grid from a generic power plant, right? Power plants generate energy, it flows into the grid, flows to the people. Community choice aggregation contracts with specific utilities. So they say, okay, plant X, you generate into the grid, and even though I'm getting my electrons the same as everyone else, it's as if Plant X gave me my electrons directly via the contract.
Particularly in affluent, well-educated, highly blue communities, that this unleashes their capacity to go out and purchase lots of solar and wind and renewables that far exceed what the state's minimum requirement is. That is true of the wealthy ones, but anytime you give things over to local governments, you're going to see huge differences in capacity between the wealthy communities and less wealthy communities, and that's going to be correlated with race as well.
And that, of course, just exacerbates the equity gap between these communities.
The problem you have is that as these communities get off of the utility, they leave the utility with residual contracts. They leave the utility with essentially the customers that often go into arrears. Plus, these cities want to buy renewables that are in excess of what the grid can sometimes handle.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say this is more than the grid can handle?
It's been a struggle between the state and the local community to say, hey, you can't just buy 100% solar because the solar doesn't work at night, and you've got to buy for every slot during the day. So, you can't just say that you're 100% renewable when you're drawing electrons off the grid in the middle of the night. I mean, electrons don't come color-coded, and you may think that you're being virtuous, but that's not the case.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of what's happening in Germany too, right? Where in the south of the country, you have people that are able to buy green energy like everybody in the country, but the green energy that they think comes from offshore wind turbines that are in the north of the country, the grid cannot handle bringing those electrons all the way to the south. So it turns out it's mostly just coal energy.
Yeah, and that's Bruce's point, right? Electrons don't come color-coded, and so you say you're paying for these things, but the grid is a melting pot of electrons, and so you're going to get, when you turn on your light, whatever electrons are on the grid. And so if the sun's not out or the wind's not blowing, I'm sorry, it's coal, it's gas, it's something other than what you're intending. I think to Bruce's point, there's a balance to be struck between virtue signaling and actually approaching the grid with your virtues in mind. And that's when you maybe want a regulator to oversee things on a macro scale. And so now that we've sort of covered those three main business models, I would love to have Bruce just quickly summarize each business model's pros and cons.
Each one of these things has trade-offs in terms of what you get. You get better scale, a greater reach across communities with the IOU. They're much bigger. They have real advantages. You get the median preference of a lot of different types of communities. With the POU, it varies with the size of it. Some of them are very small, some of them very large. So you get some mixture of both types. And then when you get to the CCAs, increasingly we worry, even though they're getting bigger, we worry about their scale, we worry about their financial viability, and we worry about the equity issues.
So if you recall, the reason we went and had this conversation, Bruce, was to answer your and I's question, Jonas, about, are these features or bugs of PG&E cutting things built into the regulation? How do we address that? And so when PG&E went bankrupt, some cities were thinking about municipalizing their utilities or making POUs, and PG&E had already been losing customers to the CCAs, the Community Choice Aggregation. So if they had lost more customers to municipalization, there was a fear that PG&E would just be left with only the dangerous wildfire service territory that was more expensive to upkeep. And so that would cause rates to go up because you're just spending more across a less populous group of people. And so because of these equity and cost issues, along with kind of trying to signal to the market that California's other investor-owned utilities had support of the state, which is important for those utilities being able to raise money and actually invest in the grid, what ended up happening is California said, no, PG&E, you're going to remain an investor-owned utility. And so you're going to have all the features and all the bugs that we just talked about, but they thought that it was for the best due to the risk of rising rates, which is already a risk, and the equity issues that would be associated with peeling different parts of PG&E's territory away.
Right. The state basically went through the different types of utilities we just talked about and said, all right, IOUs are the best option for us right now.
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is, you and I were chatting about the role of regulators, and it's not just company performance that needs to improve, it's regulators that need to improve, right? And so a key driver in the danger of the wildfires in PG&E's service territory was not just the lack of upkeep, but the service territory features also changing more rapidly than anticipated, which exacerbated some of the underlying bugs of an investor-owned utility. But we'll touch on that right after this break.
In a world far, far away, two guys who disagree get together and talk politics. Just kidding, that's this world. While our politics feel more divided than ever, most of us would like to get along. That's where we come in. Caught in the Middle is a podcast hosted by me, Zach Shapiro, and my partner in crime, Matt Kaufman. We both love the country we live in, and we both think that there is room for improvement, especially in how our politics are run. You can find us right now by searching the Forum UC3P wherever you find your podcast and selecting any episode that starts with Caught in the Middle.
This is Matt.
And Jonas.
And right before the break, we went through the various pros and cons of utility business models, highlighting how connected policy issues and regulations are with the actual business operations of utilities. So to that end, Catherine made a really astute observation about political issues and how they intertwined with PG&E.
There's also been a lot of challenges in terms of regulatory oversight and the political environment and political pressures that they faced when it came to, for example, helping the state achieve its renewable energy goals, signing largely expensive contracts for wind and solar power back when that generation was far more expensive than it is today, creating rate pressures.
And of course, political progress in terms of buying all these renewables can really put PG&E behind the eight ball.
I think we have a bit of a problem in the sense that the legislature and the governor have gone out way ahead and set goals that I'm worried about whether we actually can meet, rather than calling them aspirational and saying, well, a lot depends upon technological innovation and adoption, et cetera. And the problem with that is that it leads people into a false sense of emissions progress.
It seems like California was focusing really hard on emissions, but this was causing rates to go up.
Yeah, exactly. They were signing these really expensive contracts that they were just charging to customers. And it's not only that they were focused on emissions, right? It's that also led the CPUC to not focus as explicitly on safety or monitoring PG&E's safety as they should have.
What surprises me is that PG&E and CPUC didn't learn their lesson from the gas issues, that the regulators needed a further emphasis on safety.
Yeah, I mean, when the San Bruno pipeline explosion happened, there was a report issued that the government did, right? The federal government came in and said, okay, PG&E, this is your fault for inspections, but also the CPUC, you need to be better at monitoring. PG&E then fixed up their gas system, went on their way. Makes me think that change is possible, but unfortunately, the challenges on the electric side are different.
You think about the electric side, much, much more complicated. First of all, it's much bigger, much bigger, covers a wider area, and you've got the confluence of a lot of different risks. Northern California is very heavily forested. A lot of these power lines run through forests. And so if you have the constant potential of a tree striking a wire, and maybe then that wire throws off sparks and you've got an immediate problem there.
And of course, the changing climate is doing PG&E no favors with the recent droughts and invasive species that are killing trees. So the CPUC and PG&E
really underestimated the extent to which the climate was changing in Northern California and the extent to which a protracted drought was creating really unprecedented risk for this company. Wildfires have historically been a Southern California problem.
And what Catherine's referencing here is there were fires that happened in 2007, major fires in Southern California utilities. In response to that, were required by the CPUC to take additional fire hardening measures. But PG&E, being the utility that serves a lot of Northern California, actually didn't have to take those same measures.
That's not the case anymore. The flaw in that whole analysis was that the service territory changed so quickly as a result of drought exacerbated by climate change. The latency in addressing this on both with the part of the regulator and the company, and the consequences of that were very acute.
And so PG&E and the CPUC had their focus turned elsewhere at precisely the wrong moment.
I mean, that close focus on addressing the long-term effects of climate change, they didn't realize that PG&E's infrastructure had become an immediate threat to the state, in part because of climate reasons. That's the irony.
And so PG&E maybe wasn't focusing on its infrastructure, or at least all of its infrastructure, the way it could and should have been. I think there was, particularly with them, maybe an out-of-sight, out-of-mind problem on these high-voltage transmission lines that were extending in Northern California, but they were instead maybe focused on some of the more highly visible stuff in, like, San Francisco, for example.
And when you think about the transmission system in Northern California, a lot of it was built before World War II to support hydroelectric development in the Sierra. So the line that started the Camp Fire, it was a transmission line. It was 115 kilovolts, and it failed when a hook that was purchased around 1918 for something like 50-ish cents broke in two, dropped an insulator string that was supporting a high voltage wire. An arc of electricity surged from the wire, material and sparks fell onto the ground, and then within hours, Paradise was destroyed.
It is absolutely wild to me that there were incidents like this within a decade of San Bruno's pipeline issues, right? They fixed themselves up on the gas side, and I would have thought that a lot of the lessons that they learned would have been extended to the electric side, particularly the focus on balancing safety and profit.
I mean, I think that during this time, the company was certainly still trying to deliver to shareholders. There's no question about that. But you also have kind of a broader issue of affordability and less headroom in rates, because you saw, as we discussed earlier, the company by that point had signed a lot of wind and solar contracts that, today are just astronomically priced compared to what you would bring online right now. And customers are beginning to feel that. So they did face pressure to reduce costs for that reason as well. So it's not quite one-to-one in terms of the reason.
So just to clarify, was it maybe a misalignment of incentives and not as much the neglect?
When they were thinking about how to prioritize the system for inspections and maintenance, let's remember that a lot of the utility's performance is measured based on reliability statistics. And if you are investing in a line that serves the Bay Area, you're doing a lot to bolster your reliability metrics. If you're investing in a line that's serving a fairly scattered population in the Sierra foothills, that doesn't do as much. And that's not really the only reason why I think these lines were neglected for as long as they were. I think there's also simply, challenges in accessing them and other things, and also just generally poor records as a result of the fact that they were built 100 years ago. I mean, PG&E itself didn't build these lines. It was when they were built by another company that the PG&E acquired in 1930. There's a whole lot of issues there. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter the reason. The neglect was a huge issue.
So it really was a combination of changing climate, neglect of the CPUC, but also PG&E's own neglect that really broke the fires open. But to me, it's just so wild that there were so many stages where someone just could have stepped in, be it from the regulators or so on, but just could have stepped in and stop this whole process, be like, hey guys, we really have to take a look into what's happening on the safety side, but no one did, and then we end up with this entire mess.
It is one of those things that you can look back and kind of see the shadow creep in, right? But in the heat of the moment, it feels like it's just all these little things, right? 2007, the fires happened in Southern California. The Southern California utilities are asked to harden their systems. Northern California doesn't have to worry about that. Climate change is slower moving. And then it turns out it wasn't, right? There were problems in the north. We're going to sign all of these really expensive renewable contracts because that's going to help slow climate change, and we really need to spur that as California. Well, that's great, and it helped lower the cost of renewables around the country, and it actually has proved helpful. But that led to rate pressures, which meant PG&E needed to cut costs, and the CPUC was happy with that because it meant that customers weren't paying as much, so the governor was happy, and the governor appointed these people. Right? There were all of these little issues, as you pointed out, that easy to go back in hindsight and think about it, but in the moment, they just felt very easily fixable. It's almost like you're on a train and you're thinking that every one of these issues is you advancing at 2 miles an hour. But then all of a sudden you look up and you're just going downhill at 50 miles an hour, right? It's going to take a lot longer to pull out of that than we had originally thought.
Right. It seems like no one wanted to play devil's advocate and be like, we really have to think about what could happen if one of these power line breaks and starts a massive wildfire. But no one really wanted to be that person.
Yeah, it's hard to stop the music when you're at a party and really think like that. But I think what we also have to remember is there were so many things that all of these people were balancing and thinking about all of these possibilities that they thought were 20 to 30 years out. Maybe it wasn't worth thinking about in that moment, at least to them. But there's one additional factor that I want to bring up, right? We talked about neglect, we talked about climate change. I think it's also important to think about housing, which I know you're doing an episode on, but I just really want to highlight that, people were moving into areas that then PG&E had to go serve and string up wires, in forested areas. And so I think it's worth a quick interlude from Catherine on that. And then if people are interested, they can listen to your full episode, Jonas.
In the last 20 years, partly as a result of just how expensive it is to live in California, you do see people moving into what's called the wildland-urban interface. I mean, basically these areas that are heavily forested and prone to wildfire. And so as you see the population in these areas grow, any fire has the potential to be more deadly and more destructive, like more homes burned, more people at risk.
And this is something that Bruce also highlighted.
The sort of incentives at the local level don't match the social costs. Who should pay those costs? Should every ratepayer, including people that live nowhere near these wildfires? We have to connect up the social costs with the individual risk takers. And if communities continue to try to move into areas that are risky, and we're continuing to string up new distribution lines to these places that then cause fires, then we're in a vicious cycle.
And so, as Bruce is mentioning, utilities have to go give these new homes power, these new lines increase fire risk, and that's where housing policy comes in, right? Because a lot of people are moving to these areas because of the high cost of housing in California. Jonas, we'll leave that to you. Sorry for infringing on your territory.
Never going to forgive you.
I guess all this is to say the end result of all the factors that we've been discussing is tons of people were displaced, people were unfortunately killed, there's billions of dollars in damage. PG&E went into bankruptcy, right? And so let's now begin to pivot to getting PG&E out of bankruptcy. So California passed Assembly Bill 1054, and this did a couple of things in helping PG&E emerge from bankruptcy. First, it created a wildfire fund that utilities can tap into for large events to prevent future bankruptcies. You have to get that money from somewhere, and about half of the $21 billion was funded by California taxpayers through bonds and utility bonds, with the other $10.5 billion being funded by California utilities.
So this would increase rates even higher, despite them already being quite high.
Yeah, and this is an unfortunate conundrum for Californians, is what are they going to do for customers? And the second main thing that Assembly Bill 1054 did was create a wildfire safety certification program. And what this tries to do is address some of the regulatory issues that we've been talking about throughout this episode. And so every year, the California utilities will have to go into the CPUC, present their plan, make sure that they're on track with the wildfire safety plan. The CPUC approves the plan, and that's how they get access to this $21 billion fund in the case of emergencies. And so to the extent the safety certificate lasts, utilities are fully on the hook for everything that they have.
That seems like a very reasonable change, given that we're going to keep the current system. So how is PG&E today?
So I think the first way to answer that question, Jonas, is let's talk about the people of PG&E, and then we can get into the infrastructure itself. And Catherine and I actually ended up talking about day-to-day workers and what that means for the company.
There's a sentiment within the public after seeing all these disasters, just thinking that the rank and file workers who work at this company don't care. And that's not the case at all. But you kind of have to rebuild morale within a company that's been so villainized. So people who have been the victims of that neglect, they villainize the workers by extension. You have to have a leadership that effectively address that as well. So you have the company culture side of things, which poses its own challenges. But then you're just talking about fixing the infrastructure.
So you have to rebuild from the ground up, and to help boost employee morale, to set a new vision, they've brought in a new CEO.
The new CEO is Patty Poppe. And in July, on basically a windless, hot day, a tree fell on a distribution line not far from Paradise and ignited what became known as the Dixie Fire, which is the second largest fire in California history. And she made a very bold decision that day to basically go up to Chico, which isn't far from Paradise. It's in Butte County. And she said that the company is going to underground 10,000 miles of distribution wire over some span of time. It's going to cost about $20 billion. And that could be a game changer for the company. It could do a whole lot to reduce the risk of fires ignited when trees touch distribution wires. And we think about what the company is doing right now to try to prevent that risk. They are just constantly going out and trimming and removing trees, but it's like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, the risk is always there when we're thinking of above ground, high voltage line, What if they miss a tree? I don't know, human error, or something grows back faster than expected, or the wind lifts a branch, Physics happen.
Yeah, sometimes, just the wind comes along, throws some branches into the wires, and then you have a fire. And undergrounding these wires is going to prevent issues like that. It's going to prevent human error. It's going to keep the wires, honestly, a lot safer, right? But what's also great about undergrounding the wires is you can reduce costs in the long term, right? Because you're not paying for people to trim the trees consistently. So it's a trade-off of a huge $20 billion upfront investment versus annual expenses.
Yeah, it's like all trying to come up with the money needed to build all of that to then reduce the cost in the long run. The question is, will that fund be able to provide some of that?
Yeah, and the thing with the fund is that's there only for issues post-mortem, right? So the $21 billion that we talked about, wildfire happens, the utility can then access that fund to, cover expenses. You can't use that $21 billion to prevent wildfires. And so
that seems kind of counterproductive.
I think it's a little counterproductive in that you want to be focused on prevention, but you also need to remember that utilities are owned by the public, right? It's a public monopoly regulated by the public, owned by private investors. And so in order to make sure that the utilities have access to capital from these private investors going forward, the government needed to provide this $21 billion backstop to help prevent future bankruptcies. Should the government also maybe be providing some more money to help advance infrastructure? Potentially, but then what you're doing is you're making two bad guys instead of one, right? Right now, customers are aggrieved at utilities because their bills are high. What if you also introduce bond measures to then help utilities underground things as opposed to having utilities pay for it themselves? Now the government's not only raising your taxes and you have high utility bills. The alternative is just, let's raise the utility bills. They're already the boogeyman. Let's keep it that way.
we're talking about issues of affordability and the fact that, some of these earlier pioneering climate policies created rate pressure for PG&E. You're still feeling that, and they're having to invest a lot in the system as it is. And you want to add undergrounding to that. It's going to come down to how much the regulator is going to authorize and kind of the extent to which customers can bear that burden.
And that comes back to the confluence of factors, right? Including who are you going to make the boogeyman for all of this, right? How are you going to address political concerns? And PG&E signed all these solar and wind contracts before the technology was fully developed. They're paying much higher rates for it. And customers have to bear the brunt of that, but they also elected leaders who are going to pursue climate policy. So it's kind of this weird balancing act. On the fortunate side, these contracts are ending over the next decade. So you're going to have this almost rate cliff where you've buried lines, so you're reducing your O&M investment, and you're going to be renegotiating these power purchase agreements that you signed from really expensive rates to much less expensive rates. So that could make for a lot of cost reduction in rates over the medium term.
It's a kind of a short-term cost hurdle.
And unfortunately, in the meantime, safety issues persist and are continuing to grow. Public safety power shutoffs are where PG&E cuts off power in windy or adverse conditions to prevent the line from sparking. So it's a proactive shutoff.
You can't have safe and reliable at the same time.
Although I do want to say, to the company's credit, they're doing these power shutoffs less and less as they implement fire mitigation plans. That's not to say these shutoffs are not exceedingly disruptive to the people who lose power, but they are getting better, and so hopefully you will be able to have safe and reliable power at the same time in the near future.
Yeah, those shutoffs are probably a very big inconvenience, but you always got to think with the trade-off of having just a wildfire come and burn your house.
And that's the company's argument, right? It's wildfire or just no power for a little bit. And it's that old psychology marshmallow test. Do you want 1 hour or 2 later? And PG&E is choosing 2 later. And hopefully the people of California will get on board with that. Things are looking up under this new leadership. But I think it's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride over the short term. Medium term, things look great. But hopefully they can pull it out. And it seems like they're turning things around well. But I want to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we'll have our final segment where we can zoom out to what lessons we can take nationally from PG&E in California.
UC3P's The Forum is a screened-in porch, a coffee table, 3 bar stools, a big beach umbrella, the dining room table. It's where we gather together, exploring our curiosity about today's pressing challenges. The hosts come from far apart to pursue conversations on the policy frontiers inspiring their passion to make change. It's for examining the intersection of sports and social justice, diving into new possibilities for preserving biodiversity. It is a space to consider and reconsider our views. So settle into an armchair, snap open a beach seat, line up a coaster, and get in the conversation with Season 2 of The Forum here at UC3P.
This is Jonas.
Matt.
And we're back with Burning Issues.
Before the break, we really examined the state of PG&E today. But the back half of Catherine's book is titled, What Does It Mean for America's Power Grid? Right? How do we extend PG&E to broader lessons? And so, to start wrapping this up, I wanted to get Catherine's thoughts around what we should take from PG&E and the California wildfires.
In these past 2 years, it has become so much easier to point to the fact that many of the challenges PG&E has faced and continues to face are manifesting in other areas throughout the country.
Agreed. There was, the Texas freeze in 2021 that left people without power. That was in part driven by climate change, but also in part driven by regulatory issues and infrastructure issues.
There was a supply-demand imbalance in the Texas grid, and the grid operator had to call for rolling blackouts that couldn't roll by virtue of the fact of how much load had to be shed. And so people were in the dark for as long as 4 days. More than 200 people died. It was an absolute disaster.
Really just such a tragic event. And I think that highlights the interconnectedness of everything that's going on, right? Wildfire is not just a California problem. Climate is not just a California problem, right? Bruce was highlighting that in our discussion as well.
Weather will change everywhere, and the variance will get wider. We don't know what kind of storms you're going to have to deal with, extraordinary amounts of snow or cold that you haven't seen. You're going to have weather events that are outside the normal parameters. Things that used to happen once every 100 years will become once every 10 years or once every 5 years.
And outside of Texas, there's a ton of other ways that climate and the grid are interacting. For example,
heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, straining infrastructure that was simply unprepared for sustained temperatures of that sort. There was the utility company that serves Spokane, Washington, had to take equipment offline to prevent broader system failure, resulting in outages for customers. Hurricane Ida barreled in and took out all the transmission serving New Orleans.
And so you see across the country that the challenges are different for each utility, but the common theme is that utilities and regulators really have to figure out how to address the challenges of climate change that are manifesting in their own unique ways, in their own service territory, keeping in mind safety, affordability, and how are they going to best serve customers.
Right. It seems like Texas is just the latest and one of the more dramatic instances of this failure.
It's necessitating a rethinking of how the system was designed, because the system was designed not only to serve a different era of weather and climate, but also a different era of electricity demand. Generally, demand hasn't grown especially quickly in the last couple of decades as a result of energy efficiency and other things, but we are entering an era in which there's going to be more electric vehicles on the grid. We're going to do more to electrify our homes in pursuit of climate targets. So we're going to see load growth, which also necessitates investments in the system. How do you manage ensuring the safety of the system and balancing making investments in either expanding or strengthening the system to support all of this new demand?
Right, and the challenge of figuring out the question of how do you manage all of these safety questions, Texas is just the newest and most dramatic example.
Yeah, it's certainly very dramatic, right? And Texas is also an interesting case because you're putting all of these renewables on the grid, and renewables are great in that they're cheap, but they're not as reliable. And you have to think about how are you going to balance out your grid such that you can have a reliable grid that operates in all times. And that's not to say that other forms of energy did great during the Texas freeze either. No, they didn't. That's why there was such a crisis. But renewables have to be looked at realistically, and it's not just like their perfect source of energy.
There were periods in which renewables overperformed during that period, but there were also periods in which they underperformed. It's a less predictable form of generation generally. Of course, as we shift towards more of these resources, you've got the benefit of not having either fuel supply costs or issues, but it's creating significant challenges for grid operators to figure out how to ensure constant reliability. PG&E is a really good lens through which to view so many challenges that are manifesting in different ways at different speeds throughout the country. The need to invest in infrastructure, the challenge of making some of the large investments that are going to be critical while managing affordability for customers, and also walking the line that we've discussed earlier, and perhaps having to ramp up O&M to do more inspections to make sure that the system is safe as weather patterns and things change, while still delivering to shareholders at a time when the industry's never been more dynamic.
So as we think about renewables, there is some work to be done. We need to think about how we're going to balance load across all of these electricity demands and these increased demands. And it really leads to the question of how can we solidify the grid to allow for interstate trade or develop better batteries or think about local distributed electricity generation solutions. And I think that's really the key is how do we modernize the grid. And so this challenge of reliability is really just underscored by how dramatic the changes in our energy infrastructure need to be, right? You need to ensure affordability. You need to be putting in renewables so that you can act on climate change. But you also need to ensure reliability. And even as you're putting in all of these new things, grid operators need to have longer-term plans that account for what happens as plants retire and renewables come on. How are you ensuring reliability? How are we advancing technology? There's all these really interesting questions and things you have to triangulate and balance between. And I think that's what brings us back once again to PG&E and the California wildfires.
And so, Matt, with your knowledge of this area, what do you think is the most pressing thing, or the thing PG&E could change tomorrow and should change tomorrow?
Well, I think they've already done a ton, right? This new leadership team that they've brought in is absolutely fantastic. The people that work there, I think, are really inspired to focus on safety and focus on delivering results for the people of California. And I think one really nice change that has come out of what is a truly unfortunate set of circumstances is now regulators are much more involved. The government is much more involved. It's back to more of what the model was intended to be in the first place. And so I don't know if there's like an immediate snap my fingers change that PG&E needs to make. I think those have been made. And I think now it's Can you stick to the roadmap? Can you consistently deliver? And are there any ways that you can accelerate as new technology comes out that you can make your lines safe?
Put them underground, right?
Put them underground. Again, that's a medium-term solution. I think they're taking right steps. They're saying the right things. I think the people within the company are really upstanding people and doing the best that they can, right? No one's out to start a wildfire.
Right. That really puts me with a better outlook on this entire issue than I had before knowing all of this.
I think it's interesting to think through all the regulatory issues, and hopefully this means that other states can see California and sidestep some of this and think more proactively about climate change and integrating renewables and reliability and all of these things. And that's really the main takeaway from this, right? It's that California is an example of getting out a bit ahead of your skis or not seeing around the bend the way that you thought you did. And so always think about the potential risks, even if you think there's a 1% chance. It's important to consider them. Make sure that the regulators are there.
That's about it. As much as we all hate them, we do need a devil's advocate pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Exactly. If only we had you at the CPUC, maybe you could have solved all the issues for us.
I don't know about that, but I would have tried my best.
With that being said, I think we'll put a pin in this episode on utility regulations. Hopefully you all learned a little bit about how regulators and how utility structures really impacted the wildfires and what you can take from that to different states or different structures around the country. With that being said, I want to make sure that we thank our guests on today's podcast, Professor Bruce Cain, as well as Catherine Blunt, who is releasing a book in August called California Birthing, the Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric and what it means for America's power grid. If you're interested in that, there will be a link in the description. I've already pre-ordered my copy. We're going to be back in your feed in the next week or two. Really excited for that. Hopefully you'll tune back in. But until next time, this is Matt.
And Jonas.
Signing off.